On the cold morning of November 9, 2004, the lifeless body of Iris Chang was found inside her car on a lonely country road in California. She was only 39 years old, a celebrated, best-selling historian with a career most writers could only dream of. Her death was ruled a suicide. But the details, they were anything but ordinary. Beside her were 3 separate suicide notes, each written differently, each carrying a different tone. None of them spelled out exactly why she had chosen to end her life. One note accused the CIA and other shadowy organizations of persecuting her. Another hinted at fears for her safety. The last was quiet, almost resigned. Friends and family were stunned, not only by the suddenness of her death, but by the strange paranoia she had described in the months before. To some, these suspicions were simply the byproduct of crippling depression and the bipolar disorder she had been battling. But to others, it was something more, perhaps connected to the subject matter of her work and the dark truths she had unearthed. Because Iris Chang was not an ordinary author. She was a woman who stared directly into humanity's most depraved moments, and dared to make the world look too. Her second book, The Rape of Nanking, published in 1997, ripped open one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War, an event so horrific that survivors could barely speak of it. 4 years, Chang immersed herself in first-hand testimonies of torture, rape, and mass murder. She carried those stories inside her, like ghosts she could never exorcise. Some believe the psychological weight of these horrors played a part in her undoing. Others point to the fact that the Rape of Nanking sparked outrage, not just in Japan, where ultranationalists accused her of fabricating the scale of the atrocities, but also among powerful voices who preferred the story remain buried. Did she push too far, uncover too much? Or was it simply that no human mind can walk through hell and return unchanged? Whatever the truth, Iris Chang's final days remain shrouded in shadows, just like the event that defined her career. And to understand what really happened to her, we must first understand the nightmare she exposed. Before we continue, if you value stories that shine light into history's darkest corners, stories that are uncomfortable, unsettling, but necessary, please like this video and subscribe. It helps us bring you more of the history the world tries to forget. Because the next part of this story will take you into a place where human cruelty seemed to have no limits, a place called Nanking. To understand the nightmare that Iris Chang uncovered, we have to step back, decades before 1937, to a time when Japan was a nation sealed off from the world. For over 200 years, no Japanese citizen could leave, and foreigners were restricted to a single port. But when American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan open in the mid-1800s, the country awoke to a shocking realization. It was centuries behind the West in technology, industry, and military might. What followed was one of the fastest and most dangerous transformations in modern history. In less than half a century, Japan shed its feudal shell, adopted Western military tactics, and began to see itself as destined to dominate Asia. Victories against China in 1895 and Russia in 1905 only fueled this ambition. By the 1930s, Japan was no longer content with influence. It wanted control. But there was something darker at work than politics or ambition. The Japanese military began teaching its soldiers that they were racially superior, born to rule, and that the Chinese were subhuman. This poisonous belief would become the moral license for atrocities unthinkable in peacetime. The first test came in 1931, when Japanese forces staged an incident in Manchuria, using it as a pretext to invade. The world condemned it, but did nothing. Emboldened, Japan expanded its hold on Chinese territory, and by 1937, the stage was set for a full-scale war. The flashpoint came at the Marco Polo Bridge, a skirmish between Chinese and Japanese troops that spiraled into a national conflict. Japanese forces, confident in their firepower and training, swept down the Chinese coast. They captured Shanghai after brutal fighting, a battle so fierce it was nicknamed Stalingrad on the Yangtze. But the victory came at a cost. Japanese casualties were high, and their hatred for Chinese resistance burned hotter. Their next target was Nanking, then the capital of China. Inside its walls were soldiers who knew what capture meant: torture, humiliation, death. The civilian population was a mix of residents and refugees who had fled the fighting, swelling the city's numbers to hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, Japanese policy toward occupied territory had a name: the Three Alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all, This was not a metaphor. It was a military directive. As December 1937 approached, Japanese troops moved toward Nanking with cold precision. Soldiers sang war songs. Officers sharpened their swords. The orders were clear: crush the city. What no one could have imagined, or perhaps what no one wanted to imagine, was that in the next 6 weeks, Nanking would descend into one of the most concentrated orgies of violence the modern world had ever seen. The gates were about to break open. December 13, 1937. The gates of Nanking fell. The Chinese forces that had defended the capital were exhausted, disorganized, and terrified. Many threw down their weapons and fled. Others disguised themselves as civilians, hoping the Japanese would pass them by. But for those who remained, there was no safety. The occupation had begun. The first killings were swift, execution by rifle, sword, or bayonet. Japanese soldiers roamed the streets in packs, dragging men from their homes. Some were lined up against walls and machine-gunned. Others were forced to kneel in rows, their heads severed one by officers eager to test the sharpness of their blades. These were not chaotic, spur-of-the-moment murders. They were organized, methodical. And often, they were for sport. Survivors would later speak of contests between Japanese officers to see who could behead the most prisoners in a set time. Photographs show them grinning beside piles of corpses. But death was only one layer of the nightmare. Within days, women, young, old, rich, poor, became targets. Soldiers burst into homes and hospitals, dragging them into alleys or commandeered buildings. Some victims were assaulted by a single soldier, others by entire squads. Age offered no protection. Pregnant women were violated and then killed. Children barely old enough to walk were taken. For many victims, the assaults ended in murder. For others, the trauma would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The violence spread like wildfire. Civilians were crucified on walls and telephone poles. People were doused in gasoline and burned alive. Some were mutilated, eyes gouged out, ears and noses cut away, before being killed. Babies were thrown into the air and caught on bayonets. The cruelty defied comprehension, as though the invaders were trying to outdo one another in devising new ways to break the human body and spirit. Even the dead were not spared. Corpses littered the streets, stacked in grotesque heaps, left to rot under the winter sun. Stray dogs fed on them. The Yangtze River ran red as bodies were dumped in by the hundreds. The stench carried for miles. And through it all, the Japanese soldiers drank heavily. Survivors learned to watch the patterns of their drunkenness, knowing that when the soldiers passed out in the evenings, there might be a few precious hours to escape. For 6 unbroken weeks, Nanking was a city without mercy. Every street corner hid a story too horrible to fully tell. By the time the killing finally slowed, between 100,000 and 250,000 human beings had been murdered. Tens of thousands of women had been raped. Entire families had been wiped from existence. But even in the heart of this darkness, there were flickers of light, unlikely figures who risked everything to save the innocent. And one of them, a man few in the West had ever heard of, would become the city's unexpected guardian. When the killing finally slowed in January 1938, Nanking was a shell of a city. Its streets were choked with corpses. The air reeked of death and smoke. Families wandered in shock, searching for missing loved ones they would never see again. And yet, in the midst of this ruin, there was one place where the killing stopped: the Nanking Safety Zone. It was the creation of John Rabe, a German businessman and, ironically, a member of the Nazi Party. At the time, Germany and Japan were inching toward alliance, but in 1937 they were not yet formal partners. Rabe used this fragile political space, and the Japanese military's reluctance to offend Hitler, to shield as many Chinese civilians as possible. He and other foreigners carved out an area in the city under international protection. There, under constant threat, they smuggled in refugees, issued safe-conduct passes, and confronted Japanese soldiers directly. Rabe is credited with saving thousands, possibly tens of thousands, of lives. After the war, he returned to Germany, where he was arrested by the Allies as a high-ranking Nazi. His life fell into poverty and obscurity, but in Nanking, his name became a beacon of gratitude. When he died in 1950, The Chinese government sent food parcels to his family. Today, his grave marker rests not in Germany, but in Nanjing, beside the memorial to the massacre's victims. But the legacy of Nanking was never just about the people who died, or even those who survived. It was about the silence that followed. For decades, the atrocities were denied or minimized by Japanese nationalists. Survivors grew old, still carrying their stories like invisible scars. And for much of the world, the massacre was a footnote in the vast tragedy of World War II. That was, until Iris Chang. In 1997, her book The Rape of Nanking forced the world to confront what had been buried. She interviewed survivors whose voices shook as they recalled the screams, the smells, the faces. She sifted through photographs too graphic for publication. She stood in rooms where the walls still seemed to whisper. And she carried all of it with her. The praise was immediate, but so was the backlash. Japanese ultranationalists called her a liar. She received hate mail, threats, and relentless criticism. Friends say the weight of the work, combined with her own inner battles, began to pull her under. By the time she started researching her fourth book, on another wartime atrocity, the Bataan Death March, her health was already crumbling. On that November day in 2004, when Iris Chang ended her life, some saw it as the final victory of the darkness she had spent her life fighting to expose. Others saw her as another casualty, proof that the Rape of Nanking still claimed victims, decades after the last shot was fired. In Nanjing today, near the memorial to the massacre's dead, stands a statue of Iris Chang. Her gaze is fixed forward, not on the past, but on those who would dare forget it. Because some history wounds not just the people who lived it, but anyone brave enough to tell it.